In the very near future, all farming activities will be closely scrutinised by regional councils across the country, with particular regard to their impact on the environment. A number of groups are promoting greater farmer engagement in this area, including Rabobank and Federated Farmers. Graham Smith became Chief Executive of Federated Farmers in 2014. By 2015, a staff team had conducted a review across the organisation, identifying its strengths and weaknesses.
Federated Farmers was seen to be important. Important because it has a national network from the top of the North Island down to the bottom of the south. We have a lot of people on the ground knowing what goes on within the primary sector, particularly in a practical sense, was deemed to be essential. The second component was that Federated Farmers has tremendous networks, particularly with senior industry, government and bureaucracy. And again, that was seen to be particularly important. And so when you put the two things together, people said, Federated Farmers, you're very important. But given the issues that the primary sector increasingly are facing, you need to do more to actually help shape the thinking and ultimately help solve some of the problems. We now have three key priorities around our policies. The first is the environment, particularly water and to a lesser extent climate change. The second is around health and safety, and the third is around science and innovation. We've established two new strategic teams across the organisation. One is a national water team, and the second is a national science and innovation team. The government has a land and water partnership, which is really looking at a whole range of water issues. And so Federated Farmers is now very active with that group. Federated Farmers believes that getting involved with regional councils is essential for both Federated Farmers and ultimately the outcomes that farmers have to live with. And in particular at the moment, the big pressure point, the hot spot, is water, both quality, quantity and also nutrient allocations. We want farmers to continue to engage with Federated Farmers to help shape our thinking, but also for them to understand that we're in this boots and all. We have a lot of resources working on complex problems, and ultimately it is about ensuring we get the right balance between environmental sustainability and economic outcomes. That involves both the urban areas and the primary sector working together, because one without the other will lead to very poor outcomes. We understand that compliance costs are important, that regulation is something that won't go away. But if we're successful, there's probably two things that will happen. One is farming continues to be sustainable, both from an economic point of view, but also an environmental point of view. And that also, the types of solutions that ultimately are decided on also recognise that we need to maintain flexibility in our farming systems.
Last year we produced a report comparing New Zealand's regulations with California and the Netherlands, and highlighting the impact it has on the competitiveness of those countries' exporters. Mm-hmm.
The rules affecting sheep and beef farmers are going through at the same time as the rules affecting dairy farmers. Each council regional authority across New Zealand is at different stages of implementing the national policy statement, and we're seeing different approaches to how they address the sheep and beef risk. Essentially, sheep and beef farmers will be required to implement good management practices around surface runoff and those contaminant losses of phosphorus and sediment. Now, some regional authorities have taken quite a prescriptive approach in that they have rules in place requiring certain good management practices to be implemented, while others have taken more of an effects-based approach where they've prescribed a particular outcome they want, but leave it more so to the individual farmer to decide how best to achieve some of those outcomes. So I've produced a report looking at environmental regulation within the sheep and beef sector. The purpose of the report is to highlight some of the environmental risks facing sheep and beef farmers, some of the risks around regulations being put in place to manage those contaminant losses, and then looking at approaches sheep and beef farmers can take to start mitigating and managing some of those risks. The risks for sheep and beef farmers are more around those surface runoff contaminants, so yeah, sediment, phosphorus and E. coli, and managing the loss of those contaminants to the waterways. Nitrogen is seen as more of a dairy issue. However, it's important that sheep and beef farmers are aware that the rules and regulations being put in place to manage the nitrogen risk may also apply to them, in that if they're placed under a restrictive cap, that means they can't increase their current nitrogen leaching above their existing level. It may reduce their flexibility within their farming systems to operate in a manner they otherwise did, in terms of putting more winter crop in, increasing stocking numbers, potentially taking on dairy grazing. So it's not just the restriction it has on the land use, it's also important to understand the restriction it has on the farming system. The advice for farmers beyond getting involved in the council planning aspect is to understand their own on-farm environmental risks, their farm-specific risks, and start planning to address and mitigate some of those risks. And we encourage farmers to take a whole farm system approach when they're looking at their risk factor rather than individual mitigation practices. So where am I losing contaminants off my farm? What are the farming practices or tools or range of tools I have available to address those risks? And then which will work best within my farming system to both manage and mitigate those risks, but also enable me to maintain productivity and profitability as a farming business. R&D is going to be crucial if we want to achieve the environmental outcomes demanded by society, but also remain economic and profitable as a farming system. The role Fed Farmers and other lobby groups play in the plan change process is absolutely crucial. The rules that are being drawn up now within regional authorities are going to specify how we farm in the future. So it's really important we get the right rules up front now. And by right rules, I mean rules that will achieve the environmental outcomes that society are demanding, while not imposing an unnecessary burden on farming systems, and allow our farmers as much flexibility as possible to adopt and implement new innovations and techniques as they're rolled out into the future.
This program was made with funding from New Zealand On Air.